Must be a system error. She should have found a decent husband instead of spending her life typing on a computer counting logistics. Captain Eric, my brother, smirked. He wrapped an arm around his wife and casually strolled through the security gate. My parents walked right behind him. Not a single one of them looked back at the daughter currently being blocked by the guards. 15 years of absolute sacrifice. I bled in the most brutal hot zones on Earth, trusted with the lives of thousands of brothers in arms, only to be ruthlessly erased from a guest list by my own flesh and blood. The young perimeter guard cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I have to ask you to step aside." But the words died in his throat. The blood completely drained from his face. He instantly stumbled back and snapped a razor-sharp salute the second he saw the cold piece of metal I pulled from my breast pocket. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The scent of charred beef and lighter fluid always triggers the same memory. It was the afternoon my brother received his acceptance letter to the military academy. Our backyard was packed with men in uniform, their loud laughter echoing off the brick walls. My father stood on the patio, gripping my brother by the shoulder, his chest inflated with a pride I had never once seen directed at me. He puffed out his chest, pointed a beer bottle toward the crowd of high-ranking officers, and his voice boomed over the music. "Look at him," my father announced. "The heir to the Ward legacy." My brother puffed his chest out, absorbing the unearned glory like it was oxygen. He hadn't completed a single day of training. He hadn't earned a single stripe. He hadn't solved a single equation that made his forehead sweat. But that crowd of grown men in decorated uniforms raised their bottles and cheered for the potential of a teenage boy who had done absolutely nothing except be born male into the Ward family. My father clinked his beer against my brother's glass of soda, and the officers around them erupted in another round of deep-bellied laughter, the kind reserved for men welcoming a boy into the brotherhood. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a massive 3-tiered cake, her face glowing with theatrical pride. She held it high, navigating through the crowd like she was carrying a sacrament. She angled the cake toward the guests so their phone cameras could catch it. Written in thick blue frosting across the top were the words, "Congratulations to the future general." She walked past me in the doorway without breaking stride. Her elbow grazed my shoulder and she didn't even flinch. She didn't register the contact the way you don't register brushing against a coat rack. I stood completely still against the doorframe, calculating my exact level of invisibility in that yard. One of my father's old army buddies, a retired major with a ruddy face and a loud mouth, stepped right past me to get to the cooler on the porch. His shoulder clipped mine, pushing me back against the wooden frame. He didn't apologize. He didn't see me. I was furniture. I was the doorframe itself. I pressed my spine flat against the wood and watched my father parade my brother around the yard like a prize stallion, introducing him to every colonel and lieutenant colonel in attendance, each one shaking my brother's hand as if he had already conquered a battlefield. In my pocket, my fingers traced the edges of a solid metal disc. Just 3 days earlier, I had stood on a national stage, a heavy ribbon placed around my neck. I had won the National Gold Medal in Cryptographic Algorithms, the highest honor in computational mathematics for any student in the country. I was the youngest recipient in the award's history. The audience that night had been filled with professors, defense contractors, and intelligence officers who understood the sheer intellectual brutality required to stand on that podium. As the backyard party began to wind down and the officers migrated to the living room, I stepped inside. My father sat in his recliner, his eyes glued to a military broadcast on the television. I pulled the medal from my pocket. I stepped into his peripheral vision and held it out. I didn't ask for a cake. I just wanted him to look at me the way he looked at my brother. My father didn't mute the television. He didn't shift his weight in the chair. He didn't even fully extend his arm. He reached out, took the heavy gold medal, and gave it a 2-second glance. His thumb didn't trace the engraving. His eyes didn't widen. He held it the way a man holds a receipt he's about to throw away. "Good job," he muttered, his voice utterly devoid of inflection. 2 words, 2 syllables, the same tone he used when the mailman delivered a package on time. He shoved the medal back toward my chest, his eyes already snapping back to the screen where a general was being interviewed about troop deployments. He immediately raised his voice, shouting over his shoulder into the hallway. "Eric, get down here. We need to go over your physical conditioning schedule." The back of his recliner faced me like a wall, a leather-padded wall that separated the child he invested in from the child he stored away. I stood there holding a piece of gold that represented thousands of hours of agonizing intellectual labor, thousands of nights hunched over encryption models, while my classmates slept thousands of problems solved that my teachers said were unsolvable. It felt like a block of ice burning a hole in my palm. The television droned on. The general on the screen was talking about courage. My father leaned forward, completely absorbed. I didn't cry. Crying was an operational failure in this house. It was an admission of weakness that would be cataloged and weaponized against me in every future argument pulled out at Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties as proof that I was too soft, too emotional, too much of a girl. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps entirely silent, measuring the distance between myself and the family I was biologically tied to. Each step was a calculation. 14 stairs. 14 opportunities to turn around and try again. I took every single one. I entered my room, closed the door, and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I dropped the medal into the darkest corner, next to a stack of other certificates and ribbons that had never been displayed on a single wall of this house. National Science Fair First Place, State Mathematics Olympiad Gold, Regional Coding Championship Grand Prize. None of them had ever left this drawer. My brother's Pee-wee football trophies lined the mantel downstairs dust-free because my mother polished them every Sunday. His average report cards were magnetized to the refrigerator with patriotic magnets. My perfect transcripts lived in a drawer that smelled like old wood and forgotten ambition. I shut it with a definitive physical snap. The sound was small, but the rupture it represented was catastrophic. In that exact second, the desperate daughter died. I realized that my brilliance would never penetrate their absolute prejudice. My father worshipped muscle, the blunt instrument of physical force. My mother worshipped tradition, the ancient architecture of women serving men. And I was neither a son nor a housewife. I stopped seeking a seat at their table and began drafting the blueprint for my own empire. If they wanted a soldier, I would become one. But not the kind they understood. When I enlisted, I didn't choose the infantry. I chose tactical intelligence. My father's reaction was immediate and venomous. He stood in the kitchen doorway, gripping the counter until his knuckles went white. "Intelligence!" He spat the word, dripping with disgust. "That's a place for cowards who are afraid to hold a gun. The wards don't breed people who hide in the shadows." He turned his back to me and poured himself a glass of bourbon, dismissing my entire future with a half rotation of his body. My mother patted my arm with a sickeningly sweet smile, her manicured nails pressing crescents into my skin. "That's good desk work. Will be safe for a girl like you." She squeezed my arm and walked back to the stove, already composing the next chapter of her fantasy, where I quit the army, married a surgeon, and spent my life arranging centerpieces for dinner parties. They pictured me sorting mail. They didn't know about the bunker. It was a bomb-proof facility buried hundreds of feet underground, accessible only through 3 layers of biometric security and a freight elevator that dropped so deep your ears popped twice on the ride down. The corridors smelled of stale adrenaline, recycled air, and burnt espresso that had been sitting on hot plates since the previous shift. The fluorescent lights never turned off. Day and night didn't exist down here. Time was measured in mission cycles, not sunrises. This was my war room. The wall in front of me was a massive grid of thermal feeds and satellite imaging stretching 20 feet across, fed by 3 separate orbital platforms and a network of ground-based sensors that I had personally calibrated. Every blinking green dot represented a human heat signature. Every red cluster was a potential mass casualty event. I owned this grid. I had built half the algorithms that powered it, coded them myself during sleepless weeks, when my eyes burned from screen glare and my wrists ached from typing. And the men and women who sat at the consoles around me, the analysts, the signals specialists, the linguists who listened to intercepted communications in languages most Americans didn't know existed, they never once questioned whether a woman belonged in that chair. Down here, your chromosomes were irrelevant. Your clearance level and your kill-save ratio were everything. It was a Tuesday night, 2 a.m. The air in the command center was entirely dead. Stale coffee sat in ceramic mugs on every console, cold and forgotten. A half-eaten protein bar lay next to Davis's keyboard. I sat at my station, my eyes locked on the thermal sweep of a tight canyon in the Middle East. A 12-man Special Forces team, call sign Viper 1, was moving toward a hostile compound. Their green dots inched across the terrain in a standard two-column formation. My fingers flew across the keyboard, running predictive algorithms on the terrain, cross-referencing elevation data with historical ambush patterns in that region. Suddenly, 3 heat signatures flared behind a ridgeline to the east. I leaned forward, then 5, then 12, then 20. It was a textbook kill box. They had lured Viper 1 into the throat of the canyon, let them get comfortable in the narrow corridor, and sealed both ends with overwhelming force. The hair on my arms stood up. My stomach clenched. I slammed my hand onto the comms relay button, cutting through the radio static. Viper 1, stop ambush at your 6 o'clock. My voice was a razor blade slicing through the darkness. The green dots halted inches from the fatal perimeter. 2 seconds later, the red cluster detonated their position with automatic weapons fire that lit up the thermal screen like a brush fire. I directed their exfiltration for the next 47 minutes, barking coordinates, redirecting drone coverage to provide suppressive fire vectors, and rerouting a QRF helicopter through a sandstorm corridor that no pilot in their right mind would fly unless someone on the ground convinced them the alternative was 12 body bags. I watched the green dots move, counted them obsessively. 12 in, 12 out. That was the only math that mattered. When every single green dot reached the extraction chopper and the bird lifted off the canyon floor, the lead operator's voice crackled through the static. Copy command. 12 souls, 12 heartbeats. We owe you our lives. The analyst sitting 2 consoles to my left, Staff Sergeant Davis, a man who had been in the intelligence community for 20 years and had seen analysts come and go like seasonal weather, pulled off his headset. He locked eyes with me across the dim blue glow of the screens. His face was drawn, the lines around his mouth deep. He pressed his fist against his chest, twice, slow and deliberate, and gave me a single, silent nod. No words, no ceremony, no 3-tiered cake. Just the raw acknowledgement of a man who understood that the woman sitting in that chair had just ripped his brothers out of the grave. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow. I leaned back in my chair, my uniform soaked in cold sweat, my hands trembling for the first time in the mission. The empty canyon glowed on the screen, the heat signatures dissipating like ghosts. 12 men were in the air, 12 men who would call their mothers tomorrow, who would hold their children next week, who would grow old because of a keystroke I made in a room they would never see. Right then, the personal cell phone sitting on the corner of my metal desk vibrated. The screen lit up. I picked it up. The message was from my brother. How's the lazy weekend at the office, sis? Don't get a paper cut. I stared at the illuminated text. The timestamp told me it was Saturday night in his time zone. He was up late, probably at the same bar he always went to, 3 beers deep, surrounded by the same friends who worshipped his last name and laughed at his rehearsed stories. I had just ripped 12 men out of the jaws of death, and my blood brother was sitting on a bar stool somewhere treating me like a pathetic punchline. The glowing screen reflected off the dark surface of my console, casting his words across the same workspace that had just coordinated a multi-asset combat extraction. My jaw locked tight. The urge to type back to send him a classified screenshot of the thermal grid with 12 green dots that almost went dark flared in my chest like a detonation charge. But military discipline overrode human ego. I deleted the message. I didn't owe him my truth. I set the phone face down on the cold metal surface. I adjusted my headset, cleared the biometric data from the previous mission, and pulled up the grid for Sector 4. The enemy doesn't sleep, and neither do I. I initiated the next satellite sweep. 2 days after the Viper 1 extraction, my secure line rang. The caller ID was a 4-digit code that meant one thing: Pentagon top floor. I was ordered to report directly to the office of General Arthur Vance, a 4-star commander, infamous for his ruthless standards and his absolute zero tolerance for incompetence. He had fired colonels for misplacing commas in intelligence briefs. I stepped onto the thick carpet of his office, snapping a crisp salute. He didn't return it immediately. He stood behind his heavy oak desk, studying me with eyes that had seen decades of combat, eyes that had signed orders sending men to their deaths and received flags from their caskets. He gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "Sit," he commanded. He slid a steaming porcelain cup of black coffee across the desk. "You look exhausted, Carol." He used my first name. The strict military protocol dissolved, leaving only the profound understanding between two soldiers who operated in the dark. I gripped the hot ceramic mug, keeping my posture rigid, my spine refusing to curve even though every muscle in my body screamed for rest. General Vance leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the polished oak surface. "The report will never have your name, but I know you saved Viper 1. The president knows too. You are an exceptional soldier." The words hit my chest with the force of a physical impact. The fortress I had spent 15 years building cracked. Not collapsed, cracked. A single fissure running through the concrete just wide enough for the truth to seep in. Validation pure and unadulterated, handed to me by the highest authority in the room. The highest authority in any room. The exhaustion caught up with me. Before I could activate my tactical filter, my defensive walls dropped for half a second. "My family," I muttered, staring into the dark liquid in my cup, watching the overhead light distort on its surface. "They think I'm just a useless paper pusher." General Vance didn't offer empty pity. He didn't apologize on behalf of society. He didn't tell me it gets better. Instead, a slow, highly calculated smile spread across his face, the smile of an apex predator organizing an ambush. He leaned back in his leather chair, the gold stars on his collar catching the overhead light and throwing tiny reflections across the ceiling. "Well then," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "the Defense Department just decided to declassify Operation Blackwater." He paused, letting the magnitude of the information settle in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. "And I recommended you for the Distinguished Service Medal." He let that sentence breathe. Then he folded his arms. "Your brother's ceremony is next month, right? How about we execute a landing right on his home turf?" I looked up from the coffee. The sheer audacity of his plan mapped itself out in my mind within seconds. A declassified operation meant my name, my rank, and my missions would become public record. The Distinguished Service Medal was one of the highest non-combat honors in the entire United States military. And he wanted to drop this payload at the same ceremony where my brother would receive a routine commendation medal. It wasn't just a revelation. It was an orchestrated annihilation of my family's delusional hierarchy. My thumb brushed the bottom of the ceramic mug, and for a fraction of a second, I felt the ghost of a cold metal disc, a gold medal shoved back at my chest by a man who couldn't be bothered to mute the television. I didn't hesitate. I set the coffee cup down on the oak desk. I met Vance's gaze with absolute freezing clarity. I gave a single sharp nod. The operation was officially authorized. The trap was set, but I still had to survive the July 4th family barbecue. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a plastic cup of water, scanning the yard like a hostile sector. Lawn chairs were scattered across the grass. A folding table sagged under the weight of potato salad and beer coolers. American flags hung from the fence posts, their cheap fabric already starting to fray. My brother stood in the dead center of the lawn, a beer in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other, nearly spilling foam onto the grass with every dramatic sweep of his arm. He was surrounded by his civilian friends, a few junior officers from his unit, and two neighborhood dads who looked like they had never held anything more dangerous than a television remote. He was loudly recounting a brutal firefight from his last deployment, his voice thick with bravado and manufactured adrenaline. "I'm pinned behind a compound wall," he told them, crouching slightly to mime the position, his beer sloshing, rounds snapping over my head, dust everywhere. "And I'm thinking, this is it. This is what Dad trained me for." His friends nodded with wide eyes, completely captivated by the performance. One of the junior officers from his unit, a young lieutenant standing at the edge of the circle, took a long pull from his beer and stared at the grass. He knew the truth. He had been on that perimeter too. But rank is rank, and captains don't get corrected at barbecues. My father stood next to my brother, arms crossed, nodding with intense, misplaced pride. His jaw set in that posture he reserved for moments he considered sacred, moments that confirmed his son was the warrior he had always envisioned. I took a slow sip of water. I had read the highly classified after-action report for that exact skirmish. I had read it because my team had provided the intelligence that shaped the entire operation. My brother had been stationed 3 miles away on perimeter support, sitting in an armored vehicle monitoring a radio frequency that never activated. He hadn't fired a single round. He hadn't even chambered one. The compound wall he was describing had been mapped by my drone feed 4 hours before his unit arrived. I swallowed the truth, locking it behind my teeth like a bullet I wasn't authorized to discharge. Not yet. My mother ambushed me from the left flank. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my sleeve, pulling me aggressively toward the kitchen and away from the guests. The suffocating scent of her vanilla perfume flooded my senses, mixing with the grease and charcoal smoke hanging in the July heat. She plastered a fake sympathetic smile across her face, the kind she wore when she was about to deliver a verdict disguised as motherly concern. "Carol, a career is good, but you are wasting your youth," she whispered, ensuring the neighbors couldn't hear. "I know a surgeon. You should find a husband." I stared down at her hand, gripping my arm. 5 fingers wrapped around my sleeve, 5 fingers that had never once held one of my awards, never once framed one of my commendations, never once asked me a single question about my work. In her reality, my rank, my security clearance, and the blood on my boots meant absolutely nothing unless a man validated my existence with a ring. I pulled my arm free and stepped back out onto the wooden deck, needing oxygen. My father was standing by the grill now, his back to me, flipping steaks. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to test whether he would even acknowledge my presence at his own barbecue. Before a single syllable left my lips, he turned his body 45 degrees to face my brother, who was approaching for a refill. He effectively rotated me out of his field of vision like I was a fence post. I closed my mouth. I gripped the plastic cup tighter. My brother, noticing my retreat to the deck railing, decided to secure his position as the alpha of the yard. He stumbled slightly, his face flushed with alcohol, and pointed his beer bottle directly at me. The crowd went silent. Every pair of eyes in that backyard locked onto the space between his outstretched hand and my face. "Hey, sis," he shouted, ensuring every single guest was listening. "When are you going to transfer to a real unit? Aren't you tired of typing on a keyboard, counting gear?" The yard erupted in laughter. My mother chuckled from the kitchen window. My father grinned, his shoulders bouncing in amusement. It was a perfectly executed, coordinated public execution of my dignity. 3 family members, 1 target, 0 defenders. If you have ever sat in agonizing silence while your own family belittled your hard work to elevate a golden child, hit the like button right now. Share your story in the comments below, because it's time we stop letting toxic relatives control the narrative. I did not flush red. I did not drop my cup. I looked directly into my brother's dilated, arrogant eyes. I processed his complete lack of situational awareness. He was a captain standing in a suburban backyard, mocking the operational capabilities of a woman whose security clearance exceeded his by 6 levels. He was standing on a landmine, completely oblivious to the detonator currently resting in my command center. I gave him a cold, empty smile, crushing the plastic cup in my hand just enough to crack the rim. The cheap plastic split with a sound like a small bone snapping. I turned my back to the crowd and walked out the side gate. The metal latch clicked behind me. The countdown to his destruction had officially begun. Back at the present moment, outside the base's security checkpoint. My family had walked through the gate, leaving me isolated with the junior guard like a piece of discarded luggage. The young corporal shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting near his radio. "Ma'am," he stammered, strictly following protocol. "I have to ask you to step aside." I stood my ground. My boots were planted on the concrete with the weight of a decade and a half of covert service. My pulse remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. I was calculating the exact moment to deploy my clearance, watching my brother and his wife laughing 50 yards away inside the compound, celebrating their successful extraction of my dignity. Before I could reach into my coat for my identification, a deep, aggressive mechanical growl vibrated through the pavement beneath my feet. A heavy black armored SUV flanked by two military police motorcycles with sirens dormant but lights cycling pulled up to the curb directly behind me. The reinforced door swung open with a hydraulic hiss. General Vance stepped onto the asphalt. He was in full dress uniform, the chest of his jacket a solid wall of colorful ribbons stacked 8 rows deep, 4 silver stars gleaming blindingly on each shoulder. The entire atmosphere of the checkpoint instantly compressed like the air pressure had dropped before a storm. He ignored the frantic salutes of the perimeter guards and walked directly toward me, his stride long and deliberate. "There you are, General Ward." Vance's voice boomed, carrying easily over the wind. "I was about to send a squad to find you." The young corporal beside me instantly went completely rigid. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him the color of ash. The clipboard slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the concrete. He realized he had just attempted to banish a general officer from a military installation. The corporal snapped a razor-sharp salute, his hand trembling so violently it shook his visor, and immediately slammed his fist onto the release button. The heavy steel gate ground open with a metallic shriek that echoed across the parking lot. General Vance stepped beside me, his eyes tracking my family, who had stopped walking and were now staring back at us from inside the compound. My father's head was tilted, confusion crumpling his forehead. My brother's smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack jaw and narrowed eyes. My mother clutched her purse strap with both hands. Vance leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a frequency only I could hear. "Need me to go out there and clean them up?" he offered quietly. I kept my eyes locked on my brother's distant, bewildered face. "No need, General," I replied, my voice devoid of mercy. "Let them step on a landmine themselves." I adjusted the collar of my civilian coat and walked through the gate. Vance fell into step beside me. Behind us, the steel gate shrieked closed. General Vance escorted me past the bewildered crowds and straight into the heavily guarded VIP staging room behind the main auditorium. 2 armed military police officers flanked the heavy oak door. They snapped salutes as we passed. The door clicked shut, cutting off the noise of the civilian guests, the idle chatter, the clink of punch glasses, the rehearsed laughter. Silence. Thick, padded, bulletproof silence. I stood in the center of the room and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of furniture polish and dry-cleaned wool. The time for hiding was over. I unbuttoned the beige civilian trench coat, the camouflage of mediocrity I'd worn to appease my family for 15 years. The coat that made me invisible. The coat that let my mother believe I was a secretary. The coat that let my father look through me. I pulled it off my shoulders and tossed it onto a leather chair. It landed in a crumpled heap the shape of a woman who no longer existed. Underneath my dark green Army service uniform was impeccably pressed the fabric sharp and unyielding, the creases on my trousers precise enough to cut paper. I reached into my left breast pocket and extracted a small black velvet box. I opened it. Resting on the dark fabric were 2 solid silver stars. Brigadier General. I picked up the first star, aligned the sharp prongs with the fabric of my right shoulder board, and pressed down hard. Click. The metallic snap echoed in the quiet room. That click was the night in the bunker. That click was 12 green dots that almost went dark in a canyon 6,000 miles away. I took the second star and secured it to my left shoulder. Click. That click was a text message on a glowing screen. "Don't get a paper cut." I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the window. My uniform was flawless. The ribbons on my chest told a story my family had never bothered to read. The ghost of the neglected daughter was dead. Brigadier General Carol Ward was armed and ready to deploy. I turned and pushed open the double doors leading into the main VIP reception area. The room was packed with senior officers from every branch, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the defense of the nation. Crystal glasses reflected the overhead light. The low hum of measured, disciplined conversation filled the space. As I stepped over the threshold, the shift in the room's energy was instantaneous. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A towering Marine Corps general standing near the bar set his glass of bourbon down on the polished wood, his eyes locking onto my shoulder boards. He squared his shoulders, raised his hand, and snapped a crisp salute. "Welcome back to the Light General Ward," he said, a sharp smile forming at the corner of his mouth. "The terrorists are probably still shivering because of you." I returned the salute with perfect precision. Two colonels standing near the window nodded in my direction with a reverence that my own father had never once demonstrated. A Navy admiral across the room raised his glass an inch off the table. These people strangers bound only by service and sacrifice had just given me more recognition in 10 seconds than my bloodline had offered in 34 years. I walked through the corridor connecting the VIP area to the main auditorium. The lighting was dim, focused entirely on the massive stage decorated with the United States flag and the seals of every military branch. I bypassed the standard seating and marched directly to the front row explicitly reserved for flag officers. My boots struck the hardwood floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. I lowered myself into the seat, rested my hands flat on my knees, and felt the immediate burning sensation of eyes on the back of my neck. I glanced over my left shoulder. Across the aisle, sitting in the civilian and junior officer section, my father was squinting his brain, violently rejecting what his eyes were seeing. His mouth opened and closed, once then clamped shut. My mother's jaw had unhinged, her hand frozen halfway to her pearl necklace. My brother's forehead was crinkled in absolute panic, his eyes darting between my shoulder boards and the empty space where his understanding of reality used to exist. I turned my head forward, fixing my sights on the empty podium. The strike package was in the air. The base commander stepped to the microphone, a colonel with a square jaw and a rehearsed smile. "We proudly present the Commendation Medal to Captain Eric Ward." The crowd politely applauded, a controlled, respectful ripple of palms. My brother practically strutted down the aisle, his chest inflated so wide, his jacket buttons strained, projecting the aura of a conquering hero returning from the gates of hell. He took the medal from the colonel, shook his hand for an extra 3 seconds to ensure every camera captured the grip, and stepped to the podium. He adjusted the microphone to his height. He launched into his heavily rehearsed theater of humility. "I want to thank my father." He projected, his voice echoing off the walls with practiced warmth. "Who taught me the blood of a true warrior. Thank my mother for her grace, and my wife Chloe, the strongest rear guard." When he paused dramatically, sweeping his gaze across the audience, landing briefly on the civilian section to absorb the admiration. His eyes briefly met mine in the front row. For a fraction of a second, confusion rippled across his face. Then he deliberately skipped past me, his gaze sliding over my shoulder boards as if they were a hallucination. Complete erasure. One final time. The applause began, polite and measured. I remained seated, my hands resting still on my lap. As my brother moved to step off the stage, his expression already settling into the satisfied glow of a man who believed the spotlight was his birthright, General Vance stood up from the center of the VIP row. The movement was sudden and deliberate. He didn't wait for an introduction. He didn't clear his throat. He bypassed the confused base commander and walked straight to the podium, his 4 stars catching every light in the auditorium. The room instantly fell into a heavy, confused silence. A 4-star general commandeering a routine commendation ceremony was entirely off script. No one moved, no one breathed. My brother froze 3 steps from the stage, his medal clutched in his right hand, his face shifting from confusion to a slow creeping dread. Vance gripped the edges of the podium, his posture radiating absolute dominance. He leaned into the microphone. "We always honor those who hold the gun." Vance's voice thundered, rattling the speakers and vibrating through the chairs. "But today, by top-level declassification order, I have the honor of announcing an operation never mentioned before, Operation Blackwater." The name dropped into the auditorium like a concussion grenade. The senior officers in the front row straightened their spines. The intelligence community veterans in the VIP section exchanged sharp, knowing glances. In the quiet of the room, a loud, confused voice cut through from the civilian seats. It was my father. "Blackwater. What the hell is that?" His voice cracked on the last word, the sound of a man whose world map was being redrawn without his permission. Vance's eyes snapped toward my family's brow, a dangerous smirk crossing his weathered face. Then he looked directly at me. "And the supreme commander of that operation is sitting right here." Vance declared, his voice filling every corner of the auditorium. He stepped back from the podium and extended his hand toward my seat. "Please step onto the stage, Brigadier General Carol Ward." The entire room froze for a fraction of a second. The air compressed. 300 brains processed the information simultaneously. The rank, the name, the connection to the captain who had just paraded across the stage. Then, driven by raw military discipline, drilled into bone and muscle over years of service, 300 soldiers from privates sitting in the back rows to full bird colonels in the reserved section simultaneously shot up from their chairs. The synchronized scrape of boots and chair legs against the hardwood floor echoed like controlled thunder. A wave of rigid salutes locked into place, 300 right hands cutting through the air in perfect unison. The sound of 300 bodies standing at attention traveled through the auditorium like a physical wave, row after row, a cascade of respect that took 4 full seconds to complete. I stood up. I squared my shoulders. I buttoned my dress jacket with a single precise motion. And I marched up the stairs to the podium, my boots striking each step with the measured cadence of a soldier who had earned every inch of that stage in silence. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father paralyzed in his seat, his mouth hanging open, his retired colonel's instincts screaming at him to stand, but his ego refusing to compute. His hands gripped the armrests of his folding chair like they were the only things keeping him from falling through the floor. My mother was clutching her chest, her pearls twisted in her fist, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the slow, horrible dawn of comprehension. My brother stood near the edge of the stage, his face the color of wet cement, the commendation medal in his hand suddenly looking like a toy, a participation trophy clutched by a child at an adult's ceremony. An officer I recognized stepped forward from the third row as I climbed the stairs. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, a signals intelligence specialist who had served under my command in the bunker for 2 years. He was one of the shadows. He had eaten cold meals at 2 a.m. beside me, while we tracked threats across 3 continents. He had never spoken my name outside a classified facility. He had never acknowledged my existence at a single public function. Now standing in a public auditorium for the first time in his career without the weight of secrecy crushing his chest, he raised his salute to his brow, held it for a full 3 seconds, and mouthed 2 words, "About time." I returned his salute. 15 years of invisible service publicly validated in a single gesture from a man who had watched me work through the night saving lives that would never know my name. I halted center stage, snapping a salute to Vance. The auditorium lights hit the silver stars on my shoulders, throwing bright reflections across the first 3 rows. Vance stepped forward and opened a flat velvet case. He lifted the Distinguished Service Medal, a heavy bronze disc suspended from a white, blue, and red ribbon, and pinned it onto my chest with steady, deliberate hands. The weight of it settled against my sternum like an anchor, grounding me to the stage, to the moment, to the 15 years of silent warfare that had led to this exact second. The audience erupted. The applause was not polite, it was not measured, it was a detonation. Officers who had spent their careers in the shadows, intelligence professionals, who understood what it meant to fight a war without a name tag, stood and clapped with the force of people who had waited years to witness this moment. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a deep voice bellowed a single word. "Cool." It rippled forward. Then Vance turned back to the microphone to drop the final devastating payload. Last year, Vance announced, his voice slicing through the silent auditorium like a blade through static. The intelligence network, personally commanded by General Ward, saved an infantry company from an ambush in the Korengal Valley. The name of the valley landed in the room like a dropped grenade. Every operator in the audience who had ever served in that region sat up straighter. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with my brother. His jaw trembled. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His fingers released the commendation medal, and it swung loosely on his chest, forgotten. He stumbled backward, his heel catching the microphone cord, sending a sharp screech of feedback through the speakers that made the entire front row wince. He knew that valley. He knew that company. It was his unit. The 12 men he had never mentioned at the barbecue, the 12 men who came home alive because of a command center buried underground, were his soldiers. The paper pusher sister he had relentlessly humiliated, the girl who should have found a husband, the coward hiding in the shadows, typing on a keyboard, was the ghost in the machine who had pulled him from the grave. The psychological annihilation was total. His legs buckled slightly, and he grabbed the edge of the stage curtain to keep from going down. The second the formal reception began, my brother grabbed my elbow, his grip frantic and unhinged. He dragged me toward a vacant briefing room off the main hallway, his fingers digging into my sleeve, with the desperation of a man whose identity had just been carpet-bombed. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the kind of hyperventilation I had heard through radios from soldiers under fire. My parents hurried in behind us, my father's face drained of its permanent authority, his shoulders curved inward like a man walking against wind that wasn't there. My mother clutched the door frame for balance, her knuckles white against the dark wood. My brother kicked the heavy wooden door shut. The instant the latch clicked, he lost his mind completely. His face was blotchy, red patches blooming across his neck and cheeks, the veins in his temples bulging as his fragile ego ruptured. "You lied to everyone!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips, his voice cracking on the last word. He paced like a trapped animal, his fists balled at his sides, his dress shoes scuffing angry tracks into the carpet. He knocked a chair aside with his hip and didn't notice. "You did this to humiliate me. I bleed on the battlefield, and you sit in an air-conditioned room and get made general disgusting." He slammed his fist onto the mahogany conference table. The water glasses rattled. A pen rolled off the edge and hit the floor. A framed portrait of the base commander vibrated against the wall. My father sank into the nearest chair without being invited, his shoulders hunched, totally emasculated by the stars on his daughter's shoulders. He couldn't look at me. He stared at the carpet the way a man stares at wreckage. My mother cowered near the whiteboard, her back pressed flat against the wall, her eyes wide and wet, one hand covering her mouth, as if she could physically hold in the reality that was flooding the room. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands defensively. I did not take a single step backward. I let his childish tantrum echo off the soundproof walls, let the reverberations of his screaming die a natural death in the dead air of the briefing room. Every shout he made traveled exactly nowhere. The walls absorbed his rage the way the bunker absorbed classified secrets, completely, permanently, and without sympathy. I walked calmly to the sideboard, picked up a glass pitcher, and poured myself a glass of ice water. The sound of the water splashing into the glass was the only noise over his heavy panting. Each cube clinked against the side, sharp and deliberate. I took a slow, measured sip. The cold liquid traveled down my throat in absolute silence. Then I set the glass down on the wooden table. The dry, heavy thud cut through the room like a gunshot. My brother flinched. His pacing stopped. The shift in power was absolute. The auditorium had been public. This room was private, and in private without cameras and crowds to perform for the hierarchy was even more devastating. I was no longer his sister. I was no longer the girl in the doorway holding a gold medal no one wanted to see. I was a general officer dealing with an insubordinate captain who had just screamed in the face of a superior. I looked at him, my expression completely dead. "I never lied to you. Eric." My voice was razor-thin, cold, and strictly modulated. "I just stopped explaining myself to blind, arrogant fools." I turned my gaze to my parents, who physically shrank backward, their spines pressing against the wall as if trying to phase through it. My mother opened her mouth, her lips forming the shape of a defense, the beginning of a guilt trip she had deployed 1,000 times before. "We're still your parents, Carol." She choked, her voice thin and cracking, reaching for the one card she had always played, the biological trump card, the idea that shared blood entitled them to unconditional access. I held up one hand, palm out, and she fell silent. The gesture was small. The authority behind it was absolute. "And Mom, Dad," I continued, my voice dropping another degree, "did you ever ask what I was actually doing instead of assuming I was a useless girl?" My father's head dropped lower. His chin touched his chest. The retired colonel who had once commanded hundreds of soldiers couldn't lift his face to look at his daughter. The silence in the room was suffocating. They had no defense. No gaslighting could survive the weight of the stars on my shoulders. No manufactured pity could erase the distinguished service medal pinned to my chest. No amount of revisionist family history could undo the fact that 300 soldiers had just saluted their daughter while they sat frozen in the audience. Inside my uniform jacket, my encrypted satellite phone vibrated. A sharp, controlled buzz against my ribs. A high-priority alert. I pulled it out, verified the secure alphanumeric code on the screen, and slipped it back into my pocket. The timing was precise. The world I had built didn't stop because my family was having a breakdown. I turned my back to the door, looking over my shoulder at the 3 civilians masquerading as my family. My brother's chest was heaving. His eyes were bloodshot, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. My father couldn't lift his eyes from the floor. His hands hung limp between his knees. My mother had tears cutting lines through her makeup, her mascara trailing down her cheeks in dark rivers. "I have a mission," I stated, issuing my final command. "If you want to keep this relationship, learn respect. Otherwise, never bother me again." I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't wait for the apology that would never come voluntarily. I opened the door and walked out into the corridor, leaving them entombed in their own shame. The door swung shut behind me with a dull final thud. My boots echoed down the empty hallway, steady and measured the rhythm of a soldier who had just won the longest war of her life. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The corridor was empty. And for the first time in 34 years, so was the weight on my chest. A year later, I drove my truck up the gravel driveway of my parents' house. The tires crunched over the small stones, and the engine ticked as I pulled the keys from the ignition. The house looked the same from the outside. Same brick walls, same flag mount by the front door, same mailbox with Ward stenciled in fading black paint. But something had shifted. The American flag was flying at full staff, freshly replaced the fabric, crisp and new. I walked through the front door, removing my cover and hanging it on the hook by the entrance, the same hook that had held my brother's baseball caps for 30 years. The caps were gone. In the center of the living room, dominating the space above the fireplace, where my brother's Pee-wee football trophies once stood in a neat, idolizing row, was a custom-built, glass-fronted wooden cabinet. My father, the man who had once tossed my gold medal aside without muting the television, had spent 3 weeks building it by hand. I could see the evidence of his labor in the details. The joints were hand-cut, slightly imperfect in the way that only human hands produce the work of a retired man relearning patience. A thin line of wood glue was visible at one seam where he had corrected a mistake. Sawdust had permanently embedded itself in the creases of his fingernails. His reading glasses sat on the mantel beside a tape measure and a pencil stub. Resting on a velvet cushion in the dead center, illuminated by a small spotlight, he had wired himself, running the cord neatly along the back panel, and into the wall was my Distinguished Service Medal. Next to it, retrieved from a dark drawer in an upstairs bedroom, was a gold medal in cryptographic algorithms, polished clean. He wiped a smudge off the glass with his shirt sleeve as I walked in, giving me a quiet, deeply respectful nod. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The cabinet said everything his pride had prevented him from speaking for 3 decades. The wood he had cut and sanded and joined was his apology. Every measurement was an admission of guilt. Dinner was a completely foreign operation. There was no loud boasting. There were no fake war stories competing for airtime across the mashed potatoes. The television in the living room was off its dark screen, reflecting the cabinet's spotlight. My brother sat across from me. His posture subdued, his shoulders lowered to a position I had never seen on him. His uniform was hanging in the hallway closet, pressed and regulation, no embellishments, no theater. His wife, Chloe, passed the breadbasket without commentary, offering me a small, cautious smile. My mother served the plates quietly, placing mine down first for the first time in my life. Her hand lingered on the edge of my plate for a fraction of a second, a gesture so small it could have been accidental. It wasn't. My father ate slowly, his fork moving with the deliberate pace of a man who was paying attention to every detail of a meal he used to rush through. Halfway through the meal, my brother set down his fork. The metal clinked softly against the ceramic plate. He looked at me, his eyes stripped of every layer of arrogance I had memorized since childhood. "General." He started, catching himself, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed the rank he had once mocked. "Carol." My battalion is struggling with tactical personnel management. I was wondering if you could look over my logistical strategy." There was no sarcasm. There was no hidden blade waiting at the end of the sentence. There was only genuine humility, raw and uncomfortable, like a new uniform that hadn't been broken in. The narcissist had been broken down and rebuilt into a soldier. I nodded and told him to send me the encrypted files. After dinner, I stepped out onto the back porch, leaning against the wooden railing, breathing in the cool night air. The yard was dark and quiet. The same yard where my brother had pointed a beer bottle at me and reduced me to a punchline. The same grass where my father had paraded him like a trophy. The same fence I had walked through when I left the July 4th barbecue. The gate latch was still broken from the last time I'd pulled it shut. The crickets filled the silence now. No laughter. No cheering crowds, no clinking beer bottles. Just the clean, honest sound of a summer night with nothing to prove. The screen door squeaked open behind me, and my brother walked out. He stood next to me at the railing, staring out at the dark yard. He gripped the wood with both hands, his knuckles whitening against the grain. He was standing close enough that I could hear his breathing, uneven and strained, the breathing of a man rehearsing words he had never been built to say. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "I was a coward," he whispered, his voice cracking on the second word. He swallowed hard. His jaw worked back and forth like he was chewing on glass. His grip tightened on the railing until the old wood groaned. "I was terrified of how smart you were, so I tried to make you look small. I'm sorry." He lowered his head, his chin dropping to his chest, finally submitting to the reality he had fought his entire life. His shoulders shook once, a single tremor that traveled down his arms and into the railing. He pressed his forehead against his knuckles and held it there. True respect is never begged for. It is earned through relentless discipline and the courage to walk away from those who blind themselves to your worth. If this story gave you the strength to demand the respect you deserve, hit like, subscribe, and share how you rebuilt your own boundaries. I looked at the man standing beside me. He was no longer the arrogant boy who mocked me at the gate. He was no longer the drunk captain pointing a beer bottle across a barbecue, performing for a crowd that worshipped a lie. He was no longer the narcissist who strutted across a stage accepting medals for wars he never fought. He was a subordinate officer who had finally learned the true cost of leadership. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, applying a steady, reassuring pressure. The same shoulder my father used to grip when he presented his golden boy to the world. Now it was mine to hold. "I'm proud of you," I said softly. He exhaled. A long, shaking breath that carried 15 years of arrogance, denial, and fear out into the night air and let it dissolve among the crickets. The war was officially over. I hadn't just survived the battlefield of my family. I had conquered it, rewritten every rule of engagement, dismantled every toxic hierarchy, and rebuilt the chain of command on the only foundation that holds: the truth. And the legacy I left behind was forged in nothing less than absolute, unbreakable, hard-won truth.